my financial means, and I just had to make do with whatever I could lay my hands on, which was usually stuff I got used or from someone else. They gave it to me for free for many years. For over 10 years, my go-to jacket on expeditions was something I literally got for free from my uncle, who got it in a charity golf tournament. It was like one of those freebie door prizes.
Yeah.
And it was just this really cheap jacket, and I wore it for like over 10 years on expeditions all over the place. And then I was just getting stuff from, your most basic store, like Canadian Tire. I would go there and buy whatever I could afford. I used a Canadian Tire tent, which cost me like $20. I remember buying it in high school, and it was like, that's how expensive it was. And I used it for years until the whole thing got shredded and collapsed on me. In my canoe too. I mean, I built canoes with my father. So I had cedar strip canoes and birch bark canoes, but those weren't really suitable for a lot of the expeditions I did. So I just had to find whatever I could on Kijiji or secondhand and just scrape together whatever money I had. That's changed quite a bit now. I'm professional adventurer, explorer in residence. I've got sponsors and all, pretty much the best gear I could ask for. So in terms of my own personal technology that I use on expeditions, there's the clothing is pretty big. It would be a toss up between the clothing or my canoe. I
would have went with the clothing, but I understand the canoe as well.
So the clothing is maybe the biggest change. Under Armour in particular, Under Armour is a brand, but any kind of fleece layer that's made out of merino wool, that's a really amazing technological innovation. And the other modern gear like Gore-Tex and neoprene, it's almost like I feel like my expeditions are too easy now. Like the odds of getting hypothermia are so low with modern gear, because you can pretty much canoe through any conditions, like wet, freezing rain. It's not going to affect you like the way it would have before all this modern gear came out. If you have like the best gloves and the best jacket and all that kind of stuff, it's makes it a lot easier to tolerate miserable conditions. And when you're canoeing in the far north, like I canoed out to the Beaufort Sea one time, almost every day is wind chill below freezing and wet and cold. So the right gear is really a game changer in that regard. Although sometimes I often think that looking back, I had almost more fun back before I had all this gear, because I sort of gloried in it a little bit, and you just sort of adjust and get used to it. But that said, I'm not really going to be giving up, my modern equipment anytime soon. In terms of my traditional stuff that I really like, there's a few. Some of them are more like sentimental attachment to them, but others, like, this isn't super traditional if you're looking like something that existed hundreds of years ago, but it has been around for a long time, which is a Swiss Army knife. I'm still very much a fan of my Swiss Army knife. It's simple, but so useful. And I know there's so many different knives on the market, but I'm still very much like, I've been using a Swiss Army knife since I remember my first one I ever got. I was only 2 years old. My grandparents gave it to me for my birthday. I don't think I was allowed to play with it as a 2-year-old, but I still have that knife that I got as a 2-year-old. And I've gone into the store and looked at all the different designs, but I always, when it comes to a Swiss Army knife, I'm like, I prefer the classic, the original design. It has this amazingly useful saw that I've used for everything under the sun. And, the knife is pretty much what I need for what I use on a day-to-day basis. So the Swiss Army knife is one tool that I've used continuously throughout my whole life. And I can't really see that ever changing, ever being an improvement on that little simple pocket knife that you just, slip right into your pocket there, and it has everything you need right on it. Then there's a bunch of other things that haven't really changed. I'm still very fond of my wood paddle. I know that there are modern composite, like carbon fiber paddles that are technically, of course, better, but it's the sentimental side of me that's like, nah, I really like the feel of the wood paddle in my hand. So I'm a little bit more traditional like that. The other thing that has become much more common in recent years is that people who canoe solo are increasingly not even using a canoe paddle. They now use the double-bladed kayak paddle when canoeing solo. When I was last in Algonquin Park, I didn't see a single solo canoeist who had a traditional canoe paddle. Literally every single person had the double-bladed paddle, and they thought I was some weirdo for having a traditional paddle. But technically, if you look at it from an athletic point of view, if you're using a double-bladed paddle, you're not canoeing, you're actually kayaking, at least under the Olympic definition. That's how the Olympics distinguishes between the two sports. a double blade is by definition kayaking because of the motion, where the single blade is canoeing. So I'm still traditional in that sense, that I use the single blade, even though like I don't dispute that from a technical perspective, the double blade allows you to go faster. I mean, I think that's pretty much established fact. But yeah, I'm a traditionalist, I guess, a little bit at heart in that regard, that I still like my old wooden paddle. And I have used the other paddles. You know, I used a bent shaft one partly on my journey alone across the Arctic. So I don't entirely discount them, but I would still feel a bit weird if I didn't have at least one wood paddle with me on a trip.
Yeah, you were just mentioning traditionally and going back, and you mentioned about making canoes with your dad. And in your books, you tell us that you grew up in the woods or surrounded by the woods, and that you spent a lot of time exploring those woods. I have a friend that would call that living feral now with a child. And it's changed so much for kids these days. Well, not even just kids, even young adults. It's changed so much as having access to that kind of early start in life. And I'm wondering how much of you attribute to that early start, which I would say probably quite a bit. But then also, how do you think that's changing us as humans, that we don't have access like that a lot anymore?
Yeah, these are big questions that are probably well worth taking a lot of time to think about and grapple with. I guess I consider myself extremely lucky that I got to grow up with a forest all around me. I mean, we didn't have any neighbors. Literally on all four sides of my house was forest. And I consider that the greatest blessing in the world, that I could just roam to my heart's content in the woods all around me, and not only learn about them from a practical point of view, how to identify the different trees and plants and track animals and all that kind of stuff, but the sort of creative effect it had on me, I think, was really big. The woods fired my imagination and inspired me creatively. So I think it's still where all of my books come from. It's the creative impulse comes from the woods. And if I ever didn't know what to write, I would just go for a walk in the woods and the words would just sort of flow. And so that's my personal background with the forest. But I do think about that all the time. Actually, it's something I've thought long and hard about and did a little bit of writing and speaking about, which is why I think it is so important that everyone at least have the opportunity to have a forest somewhere nearby. And it's amazing how much green space we've lost in Canada in the last 20 years around our major urban areas and cities. I mean, cities like Toronto and Vancouver and Montreal just seem to keep growing and growing and growing. And they're becoming ever more dense. And I know people who live in Toronto, and I could never live in a city myself, but I always ask them about it. And I realized, I think a lot of people have realized over the course of this pandemic, the last 2 years of restrictions, just how much they cherish and value their parks and having access to nature, and how important that is, but how it's getting more and more difficult to access some of these places because the cities are getting denser. And I never really thought about this, but the people I know who live in the city will say, well, you know, there used to be a park I'd go to anymore, but it doesn't exist anymore. It's been developed, or this sort of thing. So I think as a country, we have to do a better job making sure that we have forests on our doorsteps. I mean, I think my ideal goal would be that every person has a forest within walking distance, because I think there's something special about not having to get in a car and drive 4 hours or something to get out in the woods, or you know, make a big trip. I think it's really essential that people are able to essentially walk to a local forest, like the way we have city parks or a local park. I think we should almost have like a local forest for everyone who can access this natural place to recharge their batteries. And I mean, if you look at where we're projected to be heading in the decades ahead, I think that's going to be even more essential. And I think, you know, it can affect us in all kinds of ways that we don't even really know yet, mentally and physically, spending almost all our time indoors now, increasingly on screens and digital technology. I mean, it's not really how humans evolved to live. I mean, our ancestors for like 99.5% of our history lived their lives in the outdoors, in the open air, wide open spaces, roaming around in nature. So, and I mean, I think it's something we need to explore more in depth and look at what is the effect psychologically on having humans now live most of their lives in front of screens indoors, because it's just so unnatural. And we really don't have to go back that far in terms of time or generations before that would have been very bizarre for the vast majority of all people. I mean, here in Canada, you only have to go back to about the 1930s or so when the majority of people in the country were actually farmers. That was literally the most common occupation. So in other words, it's not that far ago when almost everyone in Canada had a job where they worked outside. And that has changed rapidly in a very profound way in just a short amount of time. And there's every indication that trend is going to continue and really accelerate in the years ahead, as we've seen with COVID the last 2 years, so much switching to online. And I think, well, it's clear indication that we need to give more opportunities for people to at least get outside a little bit and to experience nature, to get into it, if only to unwind, right? To slow things down for their own health. So yeah, that's something I do think about quite a bit.
Well, it was interesting because there was a news story went through the news cycle the other day, but it was actually appeared a few years ago. I remember the New York Times doing a story on it, that Canadian doctors were now able to prescribe passes to the national parks in some provinces. And you asked a question in your book, in the afterword, you said, what happens when there's no more deep, dark woods? And that's part of it, and I'm sure have seen so much change, the changes that have happened to the planet and the things that are happening in Canada, because the North suffers from it a great deal, more so than a lot of places. Not to be a pessimist or to come down on the optimist pessimist side, but how do you feel about what's going on, and do you think we can pull out of it?
Well, I'm an optimist. I think the problems that we face and the challenges we face are enormous, but we have the capacity to solve all of them. It's in many cases not really a question of figuring out the answer. We already know the solutions. It's just a matter of political will. So that's partly what makes me an optimist, is that we know mostly how to solve a lot of these problems. We just have to get the leadership there to do it. And I think eventually we will, which is in some small way what I hope to accomplish in my books. I said I hope my books are entertaining, but if there's something I hope people take away from them, it's that they'll care a little bit more about the fate of wild places and recognize the value in them, and want to protect them. And I think that is definitely should be a higher priority for us. But I'm optimistic that it's something that we can accomplish. And I think there's some good indicators that things are going in that direction. I mean, one thing that's come out of the last 2 years or so is that people like green space, they like the outdoors, and they realize like this is a real national asset. We need to look at it as such and do more to protect it and preserve it, and even in some cases where we've lost it, bring it back, rewild it. And I think that this is something I try to get into my book, The Whisper on the Night Wind, which is the feeling of solitude and in real wilderness. So this is something quite different than when I'm talking about a city park or something like this, but these truly vast places where, as far as the eye can see, there's not a single human-made object. You're looking at pure wilderness, and you could wander for hundreds of miles and never come across a single road or town. That, to me, is something on a different level that's very majestic and special, and we really should think long and hard as a country about how do we protect these truly vast wild places, because there's something incredibly special about them, and they're increasingly rare in our world. Almost every other country has lost those truly vast wild places because they just don't have the space for them. And even places like Brazil, Russia, and Australia, they're being hacked up and parceled off at a very fast rate. So Canada is very lucky that we still have these places, but we shouldn't take it for granted. We should think long term. What has happened in other countries eventually will happen here too, unless we decide it's not enough just to protect little postage stamps parks here and there. We need to protect a huge, vast area so we get that feeling of real wildness. And that is a change. We're talking about some of the changes we've seen, but that's a big change that I think is important, because it's something of a catch-22. I mean, it's a real question that's worth investigating. But if you talk to people who are older than me, but they can remember, say, Algonquin Park 50 years ago or Banff National Park 50 years ago, they say those are places I used to go to escape crowds, but now they're incredibly crowded. Like there are literally millions of people who visit these places every year. like Algonquin Park in the fall, they say it's almost like a zoo because there's just so many people going there to see the fall colors. Or Banff, it seems to me like a rock concert because there's tens of thousands of people everywhere. And obviously there are older people who can remember, like, it wasn't like that before. It had a much more authentic, wild feel to it, where you could walk on a hiking trail for hours and not come across another person, where now you can't walk more than 5 minutes before, like, okay, I got to step out of the way to let this group pass me. And that is sort of the inevitable product of just having more people go to these places, but not increasing the size of them. So that's why I think it's so important that we preserve more green space, so people have a range of options. That's why I kind of say everyone should have a forest within walking distance of their home. Whereas if you live in a city and it's like there's only one conservation area there, then everyone in that city is going to go to that one conservation area because they don't have any other options. And if we were talking about a hospital, we'd be like, okay, this is a problem. There's overcrowding. There's a shortage of beds. We need to build more hospitals. And I think we need to start thinking about that with conservation areas, which is like this one city can't just have one conservation area that quickly becomes crowded and full of litter because there's too many people going there. It should have 10 conservation areas all over the place to sort of spread people out and let them enjoy sort of the quietness and the solitude of being out there in nature. So that would be like my big policy recommendation, is that, you have to have, they're probably work it out mathematically, how much green space do you need per people, and start implementing that as a policy when it comes to city planning and that sort of thing. Because I think we clearly need more in many of our cities where that is a problem, where, on a map you can see, well, they've got this green belt or this conservation area, but then when you actually go there, it's like it's much too small for the population that lives here because the parking lot is overflowing. It's just, there's way too many people here. The trails have been turned into pure mud because of all the heavy traffic. It's just this 700 acres, it might be, the 700-acre park is inadequate for 250,000 people. Instead of 700 acres, they need 7,000 or whatever the number is. I'm just making up hypothetical numbers, but you get the idea, I think.
Yeah, and it's the Adirondacks have basically been overrun the last couple of years with everybody wanting to get outside because of COVID, and then hiking became the cool thing too, right? Like it came from being kind of a little outside of the norm thing to being very, very trendy and very let's get out there sort of thing. And they've actually started to limit the number of people on the trails. You have to get permits and stuff. So that's one approach too. But yeah, it's an interesting concept now, especially as more and more people have decided that, hey, this is important. And now you've got medical people saying it's important. It's like, we need the outdoors. We need this. So it will be interesting to see. And, if we can actually manage to increase that green space. Are you working on another book? It's what everybody wants to know. So I have to ask the question.
Well, I'm not working on one right this second. I haven't started writing anything. I'm still in the process of hopefully promoting my current book, The Whisper of the Night Wind, which has only been out for a few months. And hopefully it can sell enough copies that I'll be able to write another book.
Write another one, yeah.
That's the first step in that equation.
What about a new trip? The next trip? What's the next adventure? Are you putting thought into one? Because I know you're always thinking about one, but is there one that's coming up that you think, oh, this is going to be cool?
Well, yes. I have many expeditions in the works, some more involving lost explorers in the Arctic, part of an ongoing project I've had of need to go back and do more expeditions focused on that. And I have some expeditions based around migratory birds and endangered species, some things like that. But I mean, I have a list of several dozen expeditions that I want to do some point over the next 5 years or so. But it often seems to be the case that the most exciting adventures are the ones I didn't plan, and they just sort of happen spontaneously. Yeah. The Whisper on the Night Wind was sort of like that. It just happened really fast. It wasn't really, I was doing other expeditions that year in the Hudson Bay Lowlands and elsewhere, and then this thing just sort of happened spontaneously. I stumbled upon it. So it's hard for me to predict and say, what am I going to be doing come summer of 2022? Because I kind of have a plan on paper, but I know from past experience that there's a good chance that it will totally change and I'll end up doing something I didn't fully anticipate, which I think is kind of the fun of it all. You just sort of go wherever the wind takes you, or whatever happens, you react to it. And it's part of the fun of an adventure.
All right. The latest book is called The Whisper on the Night Wind. I want to thank Adam for joining us. It's our very first podcast, and we were very lucky to get him. It's been great talking to you, and I hope we can do it again sometime.
Well, my pleasure. Thanks for having me.